Exactly. You know what I mean? When you think about those guys, they're bigger figures. Not as tragic as maybe as Bigger Thomas. But like anytime you hear about these, Gucci Mane or these different rappers and run-ins with the law and all this other stuff, or the way that they're depicted as being ignorant, you know what I mean? Like people like Trinidad James or whatever, I think you have to situate them within that context and understand that their performance of Black Southern masculinity should be seen in the same kinds of context, which is it is a way of resisting systematic oppression. It may not be nice and neat, and it may not adhere to the politics of respectability, but to couch that simply in the context of ignorance is probably misplaced. And so I think there's a lot more work to do. But I think for me personally, I think Scarface is the one I would want to look at most directly and work through the most in terms of that particular context. But it really applies to a lot of rappers who have gone through the same kinds of things that Bigger Thomas kind of went through. And remember, it's important to note this: Richard Wright intended for Bigger Thomas to be a blueprint. As James Baldwin and others pointed out later on, it was a very faulty blueprint. But remember, he does this essay where it's like the making of Bigger Thomas. He talks to people and pulls Bigger Thomas together from a collection of young black men, some in the South,
right,
that he knew of, and that Bigger becomes this composite of black masculinity in the sense that he's wrestling with black male challenges with white supremacy, black male challenges with gender and with gendered oppression and class oppression. Now, obviously, that is not a holistic composite of black masculinity. That's where James Baldwin's work and other people who critiqued Richard Wright, I think, is on point. But I wrestled less with the critique of Wright in the Bigger Figures piece and tried to think more about, in a lot of my work, what you'll see is I'm obsessed with like patterns and repetition. And so when you see things repeated, that's very, very important. I would also say that Big Boy from Outkast fits into this conversation because part of what's important to note about that whole tradition is that Big Boy's name comes out of his rap moniker comes out of the Southern cultural tradition that Richard Wright is trying to tap into. In one of my favorite Richard Wright pieces, a short story called Big Boy Leaves Home, the main character is this young man named Big Boy, who's like he's and this is like a Southern tradition. He's like a big kid. Right, he's not even quite yet a teenager, but he's a big dude, and that Big Boy nickname was one that was used frequently in the South. Now, the circumstances for Big Boy leaving home are tragic. He basically has to witness, after a series of circumstances, he has to witness the brutal lynching of his close friend, and then he's kind of ferreted out of the South in the same way that you would escape on an Underground Railroad in slavery. And the readers are left wondering what kind of life he's going to have in the North. And so for Big Boy to take that name is one way in which Outkast is tapping into these rich cultural traditions that I think, again, presents the sort of sophisticated and the kind of thickness that people like to think about in terms of my age, and like you grow up on hip hop, you love to see that kind of rich dipping into the traditions of black culture. So even with his name, he's a bigger figure in some ways. And remember, for him, the name is about him being bigger than life. It's not a physical bigness, because if you ever see Big Boy, he's not the biggest guy in the world, but that name is about his voice is big. His sound is big. His persona is big, and I think this is a really powerful signification on Richard Wright tropes that are related to the bigger figures in hip hop culture.
I mean, but even to back it up just a step further, Richard Wright is from the South. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, he is.
So it's like even to start that conversation, there's always this sense of trauma and pain associated with Southern blackness that Wright and Ellison. They pull from, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So with the Big Boy story, when you were talking about we don't know how he does up north, it made me think about Rudolph Fisher's City of Refuge, and when you had King Solomon Gillis migrate from the South up to New York, and he was talking about colored policemen and all this other stuff. I mean, like, one of the things that I argue in my own work is that Southern Black cultural expression is cyclical, meaning that there's historical undertones that continue to evolve and recycle themselves in ways that you might not necessarily see in more industrial and urbanized areas. And that's one of the things that I really do like about Outkast, that there is an awareness of that history that continues to, make itself present in ways that it doesn't manifest in industrialized areas. But when you were talking about the bigger figure in hip hop, something else that I was thinking about was the idea and the concept of the American dream, which is also a huge cornerstone of not just Black literary tradition, but also just American literary tradition. You know what I'm saying? And the way that American dream manifests in Southern Black expression is different than in other areas.
Yes.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, how Outkast kind of subverts or reinvents this idea of the American dream to speak to a more contemporary South.
Yeah, so they do a couple of things. One, the American dream, the way it's initially configured, is a very individualistic dream. One thing that Outkast represents, not just through the group, but through their whole collective, through the whole Dungeon family process, and in their music that's always talking about how you come up, and their music was just always often aspirational, is that they're interested in a collective come up. They're interested in a collective American dream, right? And so I think, that's not to say that there aren't people in the North who have had this sensibility. I'm saying that Outkast brings that sensibility from the South. And it's in the very formation of their organization, not just the group, but you think about, Goody Mob and the rest of the Dungeon family, which is not as neatly connected as it was back then, but still their sense about that was a come up that was a community come up. And when you think about some of their songs and the ways in which they're thinking about aspiration, it's not aspiration to the 1%, right? Aspirational things for Outkast are like in our stratosphere. We need to come up from like the dirt, right, to be above ground. In my underground book, I write about liberation as an underground song, right? Because when you're talking about themes of struggle and liberation, there are scholars who have already said that has to be mapped onto our sense about what underground hip-hop is. And that whole Dungeon family underground ethos, again, like my work is really invested in that. That the come-up is this figurative thing. Being aspirational is this sort of figurative sensibility. But the models for that, for us, are not about like you start at ground level and then you go to the stratosphere. The models of that for us is you start in the dungeon and then you emerge from that dungeon and you climb your way out and you build from there. And so I think Outkast aesthetically, but also content as well as form, is really deeply invested in an altered sense of what the American dream is. For them, the American dream is much more communal and it's much more interactive. It's not as individualistic as the original sense of that term.
No, I can definitely get with that. I think that's especially dope, Dr. Peterson. All right now. In addition to that, I also was thinking about the idea of mortality and what that plays, especially in the South. It's not just the South. I mean, I know that it comes about in different areas of hip-hop. I mean, Tupac and Biggie immediately come to mind for me when playing around with this idea of mortality and what that means for their identity and Black masculinity. But you have a book coming out about mortality in hip-hop, which I cannot wait to read. How does what are some of the ways that you think that Outkast builds upon that trope of mortality and death in their music? I think that when you look at Southern Playalistic, you kind of get a hint of that, but it's not really until you get to like ATLians with like Mainstream and Decatur Psalms and even Liberation and Aquemini, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
That you really get to get a sense of what that idea of suffering and mortality means in a more contemporary moment. It's always been there in Black literary tradition, especially from Southern Black writers, right? I mean, like that is the foundation of their experience, is this idea of trauma and pain as a result of simply being Black in the South. So I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that Outkast, builds upon that tradition and tweaks it to reflect a more contemporary moment?
Yeah, and so this book project, which hopefully will be my second monograph, playing around with the title a little bit, but it's going to be called Hip Hop Figures, You know, it's like just a collection of essays. But I remember I was on radio with Mark Anthony Neal, and he said he referred to the project as Dead Presence, which is the title of one of the essays in the project. And it's interesting to think of it that way, to think about like how the intersection of commerce and mortality plays itself out within hip-hop culture. I think people are going to read this collection and they're going to think I'm obsessed with death, and it's really not that. It's just that when you study hip-hop for as long as I have, you see those two themes intersect all the time. And I think that there is the real death and the real trauma that these artists are sort of the point of consciousness for. So they have to sort of reflect on the pain and death they see in their communities. Outkast is also quite adept at reflecting on the poverty that they see in their communities, but then it intersects often with the commercial culture, and I think that's where the tension for me seems to be to emerge and seems to be important. The reason why Liberation is such a great song to think about in this context is because, remember, they're talking about liberation in multiple ways, right? Some of this is definitely just about like not being locked up, not being in prison. That's why that Nathan sort of interlude is so powerful to me. But a lot of what liberation is about being liberated from what other people think about you, right? About being free from other people's sense of who you are and what you're supposed to be. And I think for Outkast, that's something that lives and breathes like in the communities that they're from, where like we need for young people to stand on their own and not always be influenced by what other people think about them. But it also has a very specific sense of a sensibility within the artistry itself, that for them as artists, they don't want to care about what another person thinks about or another person thinks about them. As artists, they have to continue to push the envelope, to be on the vanguard. And for them in particular, because people have, you know, people want to bring back the Southern playalistic ATLiens Outkast. Like, that's what they want to see back. We're not going to see that Outkast anymore. You know, whatever they're going to do going forward, you're not going to see the Stankonia Outkast anymore. You're not going to see the Equimini Outkast anymore. And what they're telling you in Liberation is that they're free from that. They're artists. They want to do what they're going to do. But that moment of liberation is really, really important. And that, by the way, is a liberation from commercial culture. And so I feel like, you know, it's not that the things that I think about or write about are applicable everywhere, but when you're talking about the intersection between commerce and mortality in hip-hop, that applies to things well beyond what I'm writing about in this collection. Like I said, my biases are East Coast, so in the collection, it has the Bigger Figures piece in there, it has my Nas piece in there, I talk about Dead Prez in there, you know, I'm talking about Biggie Smalls in there, I got a long piece on Biggie Smalls in there, but then I talk about, like, you know, I talk about Emmett Till, which is a really important piece, really, and that Emmett Till piece I think came out of African American Review, but that will be in this collection. And I talk about James Brown, right? And so what I'm trying to do here is give people a sense of the coordinates within which or across which we can think critically about that intersection between mortality and commerce. And it's not just about artists dying, but it is about, in some ways, me reflecting a lot on how mortality and commerce work together within the culture. What's different and distinct about Outkast in that context, though, is that liberation is, and really just if you think about how they transform their sound and themselves for each album, liberation is kind of the thesis of that. It shows you that they're very much aware of those intersections and that in a lot of ways Outkast transcends them.
Mm. You know, I mean, folks might be tired of me talking about it, but I just can't. Is when
you should talk to everybody about this group. This is one of the most important groups in hip hop. And by the way, we can use Outkast's work to talk about anything. Yeah. Right? It's a portal, right? We can get to anything through their music.
No, I mean, most definitely. But I mean, like, I've asked plenty of guests what, you know, the connection between Outkast and these recent tragic deaths of these young boys have been. Yeah. But to give it a larger context, you know, you have Emmett Till, who was almost just a bigger figure by association. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Yeah. And then you can kind of map that out up until more recently with Jonathan Farrell and Jordan Davis. You know what I'm saying? This expectation of you know, pathology, of violence that is imposed upon these young black boys, right? It's almost like, you know, I have to make you a bigger Thomas in order for me to actually recognize that you're black and male. You know what I'm saying? So when we think about Outkast, you know, one of the things that's really dope is that they really blur and murk up those lines of what is acceptable Southern Black masculinity, and what is not. I mean, like, you have the touchstones of familiarity, like with the pimp culture and stuff like that, but I mean, like, that's not the only representation. So, you know, how do we put them in conversation with the Jordan Davises and the Trayvon Martins and the Emmett Tills? I mean, like, there is that connection. So how can we use that idea of mortality, death, and even resurrection to think about what that means in hip hop?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of what work 3000 or Big Boy, what work they've done directly on these cases. I wouldn't be surprised if they've helped out in their own way with these issues. But what's powerful about their entire career is that Big Boy and 3000 together represent a certain kind of double consciousness within hip-hop culture.
Yes.
Right? And they're very much aware of this. In fact, if you look at them over the course of their careers, they have stayed in those lanes in more pronounced ways as they've progressed through their careers. And and Big Boy being in the lane of embracing the bigger figure, right? Embracing pimp culture, embracing gangster culture in a very sort of direct way, in a very, very sort of intelligent way. And Andre 3000 embracing and representative what's the alternative, whether that's a fashion sensibility, whether that's singing instead of rapping, you know, whether that's playing the enigmatic intellectual, whatever it is, they have embraced the sort of double consciousness model that they established for themselves early on. And so when we look to them and look at their career and who they embody in their rap personas, that gives us a great sort of entree into understanding the limitations within which the Jordan Davises and Trayvon Martins are seen in the South. And so the South only sees them in the way, in a limited sensibility of the bigger figure. Like, they're all menaces, they're all armed, they're all out to rape and destroy society, so on and so forth. And again, Big Boy has been very, very effective at playing that role, but also turning it on its head. 3000 comes from the exact same circumstances, but look at the persona and look at what he projects, right? But so together, what they do is they provide for us the coordinates of the range of black masculinity that we need to actually be aware of in order to not succumb to the sort of stereotypical reactions that we see in these justified homicides. And so I think, and this is maybe a little bit more complex than the average listener is going to necessarily engage, but Big Boy and 3000 provide a generative model for us to think across the spectrum of black masculinity. We can ignore that at our own peril. But if you can understand that the same exact neighborhood produces an Andre 3000 that produces a Big Boy, then you can better understand that when you're making assumptions about a Jordan Davis or about a Trayvon Martin, that you're probably going to be wrong. And so they present us with an opportunity to grasp the range of black masculinity emerging in the South. It's just sad and unfortunate that not enough people will realize it as such.
Oh, man. Wow. Dr. Peterson, you know you're that dude. How can people get in touch with you? Tell us, you know, what you're working on. Sure.
So follow me on Twitter at Dr. James Peterson. Check out my website, www.drjamespeterson.com. And my first book is due out in September. This is not public yet. I haven't even released this yet. It's called The Hip Hop Underground in African American Culture. It's coming out on Palgrave Macmillan. It should be out in September as long as I stay on my little copy editing deadlines. Cover by John Jennings is absolutely amazing. I may not have the best hip hop book, but I got the best hip hop book cover, yo. Period.
Well, that's until my stuff drops.
But John Jennings killed the cover for me. And then I'm working on this other project, which I think tentatively titled Hip Hop Figures, and that's the one that's really wrestling with money and mortality. That's with Mississippi University Press, and that could be out later in 2014, but that's probably a 2015 project. So those are the book projects right now, and you know, if you watch MSNBC, you can obviously see me on there a few times a week as well.
Dope. Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for giving us a little bit of your time. We appreciate you. Can't wait to read the books, plural.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.